Welcome. In this video, we're going to continue working through Daniel chapter 11, verse 30, which is all about the 6th Syrian War. But before we read the verse, we just need to take a step back and appreciate that the 6th Syrian War is not a single event, but rather multiple events. The war begins in 169 BC, when Antiochus launches his first attack on the Egyptian king Ptolemy VI. Antiochus successfully defeats Ptolemy in battle, but he isn't able to besiege Alexandria, so he decides to return home. On his way home, Antiochus attacks Jerusalem, and this is our second event of the war, which also occurs in 169 BC. This attack on Jerusalem is also recorded for us in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, which was spoken about in a previous video. Now after this, Antiochus returns again to Egypt to attack it for a second time in 168 BC. And in this second invasion of Egypt, Rome steps in. This is the famous Day of Ulysses, which we've also spoken about in a previous video. Antiochus knows that he's absolutely no match for the Roman Empire, and therefore concedes defeat and promises not to attack Egypt. And as you can imagine, this is absolutely humiliating for him. Now, while down in Egypt, a rumor spreads back in Jerusalem that Antiochus has been killed. Now, this is where it's important that we take another step back and remind ourselves what's going on in Jerusalem. At this time, Menelaus is high priest. But remember that during the reign of Antiochus IV, there were two previous high priests. The man who was first high priest was Onias III, and he was the legitimate high priest. But Onias's brother Jason bribes Antiochus for the high priesthood and promises to Hellenize Jerusalem, which means to make it more Greek and less Jewish. The book of Daniel will call Hellenization forsaking the covenant, which we'll see later on. So Antiochus takes the high priesthood off Onias and gives it to Jason. But then what happens is that the man Menelaus does the exact same thing that Jason does. He bribes Antiochus with even more money and promises to further Hellenize Jerusalem. So Antiochus takes the high priesthood off Jason and gives it to Menelaus. Now, in the eyes of a faithful Jewish person at the time, Menelaus is far worse than Jason, because at least Jason was the brother of the legitimate high priest Onias, so there was still some sort of continuity. In contrast, Menelaus had absolutely no right to be the high priest. Now, all of this information is very important to keep in the back of our minds, because as I said before, during this time period, everyone in Jerusalem thinks that Antiochus has died down in Egypt. So, Jason, thinking Antiochus is dead, tries to overthrow Menelaus. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, "Meanwhile, rumors reached Palestine that Antiochus had been killed. Jason, who had been deposed as high priest by Antiochus in favor of Menelaus, led a group of rebels to storm Jerusalem, forcing Menelaus to retreat to the citadel to join the mercenaries. The timing of the rebellion could not have been worse." End quote. And the reason why the timing is so bad is because Antiochus is already angry about his defeat to the Romans, and now he has an insurrection on his hand. So he is furious. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, "Already humiliated by the Romans, Antiochus unleashed the fullness of his anger upon the Jews." So Antiochus attacks Jerusalem. And this is our fourth and final event of the 6th Syrian War, the second attack of Jerusalem in 168 BC. And during this attack, Jason is defeated. Having now reviewed all this history, let's now read verse 30 of Daniel chapter 11. It reads, "For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw." End quote. So this part of the verse is referring to Antiochus's second attack of Egypt in 168 and his humiliating encounter with Rome. The verse then continues, quote, "He shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant." End quote. Now, this section of the verse is referring to Antiochus's second attack upon Jerusalem in 168 after Jason tries to revolt. Now, the ending phrase in this verse, that Antiochus shall pay heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant, on first glance is a little bit confusing. But what it means, as Siao writes, is that, quote, Antiochus supported those who forsake the Holy Covenant, that is, Jewish renegades like Menelaus, end quote. So remember, even though Jason isn't a good guy, he still has more of a claim to the high priesthood, being the brother of Onias, and therefore Menelaus is seen as the one who truly represents forsaking the covenant. Now, having reviewed the history and broken down the verse before us, it's now time to ask a very important question, and that is, what sources do we have that any of this happened at all? Our sources are 2 Maccabees chapter 5 and the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q248. Let's begin by reading 2 Maccabees chapter 5. It reads, quote, "About this time, Antiochus made his second invasion of Egypt." So let's stop here for a moment. This is referring to when Antiochus attacked Egypt for the second time in 168 BC. We'll continue reading. "When a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no fewer than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault on the city. He did not, however, gain control of the government. In the end, he got only disgrace from this conspiracy. He fled again into the country of the Ammonites. Finally, he met a miserable end." We then continue to read, quote, "When the news of what happened reached the king, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. He commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses." End quote. So this part is obviously referring to when Antiochus attacks Jerusalem for a second time in 168 BC. So this is our first source for this event. Our next source is a Dead Sea Scroll known as 4Q248. Now, as you can see, it is very fragmentary. So as we're reading through it, it's important to remember that whenever you see square brackets, that's when there's a gap in the text, and those words are what scholars believe are in those gaps. Okay, so let's begin by reading the first 5 lines of this, which is referring to the first Egyptian attack in 169. And remember, this text is talking about Antiochus IV. Quote, "And he shall rule Egypt and Greece, and against the God of gods he shall magnify himself. And in thus he shall eat the flesh of their sons and daughters in the siege of Alexandria. And the Lord shall cause his spirit to go through their lands, and he shall return from Alexandria." End quote. Lines 6 and 7 seem to be recounting Antiochus's first attack of Jerusalem in 169 BC. They read, quote, "And come to Egypt and sell its lands, and he shall come to the temple city and seize it and all its treasures." End quote. Then line 8 seems to be recounting the second invasion of Egypt in 168. It reads, quote, "And he shall overthrow the lands of foreign nations and then return to Egypt." And then finally, lines 9 and 10 don't seem to correspond to any specific event, but just seem to conclude the text. They read, "And when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, then shall all these be fulfilled. The children of Israel shall repent." End quote. Now, what makes this text so interesting isn't merely that it confirms what we read in Daniel 11, but also the fact that it doesn't talk about the next major event in Jewish history, which happens just a year later, which is the abomination of desolation in 167 BC. Since it doesn't mention this major event, some scholars believe that this text should be dated to 168 BCE, meaning it predates the book of Daniel, if we take the late date of Daniel, of course. Esther Eschel writes in her commentary on Daniel, quote, "The lack of any reference to religious persecution in our text is of great significance when compared with the instances of persecution in the book of Daniel. It is inconceivable that such an event, one of the most traumatic in Jewish history, would be omitted unless 4Q248 was written before the persecutions took place. We accordingly suggest that this composition be dated just after the second invasion of Egypt, i.e. to 168 BCE." End quote. So according to Eschel, this text should be dated to after the second attack of Egypt. Eschel then concludes by saying that, quote, "Thus, 4Q248 might be regarded as part of an apocalyptic work that was one of the possible sources of the book of Daniel." End quote. Now, that truly is an incredible idea that this text may have been a source for Daniel chapter 11. And as we continue on our journey, we'll be speaking more about this fragment and providing further evidence for this claim. So to conclude, we are now up to the next major event in Daniel chapter 11, and for that matter, all of Jewish history, and that is the abomination of desolation. I hope you join me for the next video to discuss it. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, your support would be greatly appreciated. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. Find the link in the description below. A small donation of just $1 a month makes a big difference, so please consider donating if you can. If donating isn't something you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button and leave a comment. And finally, make sure you are subscribed to get my next video. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.